Well, hey everybody. Today I am going to be starting a new little series or part of the channel. I don't know what to call it. Well, I know what to call the series. It's going to be Bible by the Bite. And the idea is we're going to go through books of the Bible, verse by verse, and we're just going to flesh out what they're saying and try to think about some of the historical context, things like that, things that inform our study of the scriptures. And so hopefully one day I can do these as a live stream. I'm just messing with a new program right now. So this won't be live streamed, but maybe in the future we can. It'll be cool. Anyways, I thought a good book to begin with would be the book of Ruth because it's fairly short. It'll still take a while to get through, but it's fairly short. It's incredibly powerful. It's really easy to understand, and I just really enjoy the book of Ruth. So I think we'll go through the book of Ruth, and maybe I don't like the way this works out for the channel, and I'll stop doing it. But as of right now, I'm going to give it a shot and see what happens. So let me share my screen here. Hopefully this works. I've had so much trouble with this software, mostly because I don't know how to use it. But let me see if I can share my screen, entire screen, share. So you should be seeing what I'm seeing. And this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. So Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, really important. It sets us in a historical period. So we know that this happened while the judges were governing. We don't know exactly when. Some people speculate that it was 1100-ish BC, but we don't know exactly when this happened, to be truthful. But we know that it was during the judges. So think of like Gideon, think of Samson, think of those kinds of judges. And this is when it happened. And it's important that it says that there was a famine in the land. Because if you know the history of Israel, if you've gone through the book of Judges, you know that Israel was incredibly cyclical in their worship of God. God would rescue them. A judge would come and set them straight, and they would love God, and it was amazing. And they were like, yes, God, we're all for you. And then that judge would die, and the next generation would ultimately turn their backs on God and apostatize, and then God would send judgment. And he would send either a famine or he would send a foreign nation to oppress them. There would be conflict within Israel themselves. God's judgment would present itself in hopes that they would turn back to God, and he would send a judge, and they would turn back, and then that judge would die, and then they would apostatize. God would intervene, they would come back, the judge dies, they apostatize. And through the book of Judges, just read it over and over and over again. Israel is worshiping God and then falling away, worshiping God and falling away. And so what we're meant to see here in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, is that Israel is currently in a period where they have turned away from God, where they have apostatized. And as a result, the land of Israel, particularly here, the land of Judah, is experiencing a famine. So verse 2 says, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So now we go from the land and we narrow it down to one specific man. We'll learn his name later, but it's narrowing into one family and a certain man from Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem here is an important word, especially for the context, because it means house of bread. That is the Hebrew equivalent. A certain man of the house of bread in Judah went to sojourn. And notice why he's having to leave, because the house of bread had no bread. So there's some irony here. There's some maybe humor, but there is also a reminder that Israel is not positionally in a place that they should be. They have rejected God. They are rebelling from him. And so these people who were supposed to be from the house of bread do not have bread. And not only do they not have bread, now they are having to sojourn. They're having to travel with the hopes of living in the land of Moab, which this is not a literal translation, but you could replace the land of Moab and the word Moab, you could replace it with enemy. So a certain man of the house of bread in Judah went to sojourn in the land of his enemies with his wife and his 2 sons, because Moab and Israel were not friendly, right? In Genesis, we have the account of how the Moabites came to be, and the Moabites came to be through an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. Out of that abomination, as the Bible would call it in Leviticus 18, out of that abomination came the people of Moab. And so these are the people that he's having to go into, these enemies of Israel. And then most recently in their history, Eglon the king of Moab had been oppressing Israel. And so this would have been recent in their memories, like, oh man, we have to go to the land of Moab, the land that just oppressed us, that when we were coming back from Egypt, the land that didn't want us to pass through there, our enemies. So that's kind of what's happening here in the first two verses. It's kind of, I would say, documenting the downfall and the consequences of apostatizing from God. Now they are at the mercy of their enemies. They are at the mercy of their food because they don't have their own. And all of this, remember, going back to the beginning, all of this is because they chose to reject God and apostatize. So we've narrowed it down from the land to a certain man from Bethlehem. So we're very narrow, but now we're going to be specific, and it's going to tell us who this man is. So Ruth chapter 1, verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Machlon and Kilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem and Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. So not much about this verse, right? It's just telling you there was this man, his name was Elimelech, and it tells you his family, and it tells you where they're from again, and then it tells you that they were in Moab and stayed there. Things we already knew. We had already talked about that. The difference is now we're being specific. Now it wasn't a certain man, it was Elimelech. And it wasn't just any wife, it was Naomi and sons, Machlon and Kilion. So we're getting very specific. And the name Elimelech, I highlighted it here. The name Elimelech is an important name because his name translates to my God is king. Eli, my God, Melech, king. My God is king. And yet he's having to travel to Moab because he has no food, and he has to travel into the land of his enemies, the land of his former oppressors, because his land has no food. And so it calls to question, if you're reading this, did Elimelech really believe his name? Did Elimelech really think that his God was king? Was this going to Moab not a sign of disbelief, a sign of not having faith? Because would it not have been simpler to repent and to trust in the Lord? Right? This is questions that you would ask. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but these are questions that you would ask if you're reading this. There's a man whose name is my God is king, and he's leaving the land of Israel, the people of God, to go to Moab, those enemies that came from an incestuous relationship. Does he really believe his name? And this is what you would be thinking. I can't remember exactly the translations, but Machlon and Kilion have ominous names, right? They have names that kind of make you feel like, ooh, something's about to happen. I think Kilion means like the end is near or something like that. But their names, regardless of what they actually are, they have this tone of omens, right? There's some concern there. And then Naomi comes from a root to be pleasant. So that's kind of their name meanings and all of that. Ephrathites, it was just a small community outside of Bethlehem. It would just mean that they were in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, by the way, well, we won't talk about that. It's less important. So they enter the land of Moab. They have made their travels. They've gone from Bethlehem in Judah, and now they have entered the land of Moab, and the scriptures say that they remained there. And what happens? Well, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Disaster strikes, the worst thing you could imagine if you're Elimelech. You died, right? And now put yourself in Naomi's shoes. You are in a foreign land, in a land of former oppressors, in a land of your enemies, in a land where everybody thinks, oh, she thinks she's better than us. You're in that kind of land. You can't even go back home because there's nothing for you at home. There's no food. You might just die on the journey. Like, you don't have anything there. And now you have these two sons and you feel alone and you feel sad. And I wonder if you questioned, if you were Naomi, I wonder if you questioned Elimelech's decision to leave the land of Israel and go to Moab. I don't have an answer for that, but it makes me wonder. And then the two sons, they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Moabite women, this is going to come a lot. The book of Ruth, whoever wrote it, by the way, we don't know who wrote it. I think the Talmud says that Samuel wrote it, but we don't actually know. But whoever wrote it went to great lengths that you would not forget that Ruth was a Moabite woman. Over and over, he's going to address her as the Moabitess, the woman from Moab, over and over, because he does not want you to forget that this woman is from Moab. And I'll just say this, some people think that it was outlawed for the people of Israel to take wives from the Moabite people, because there is a verse that talks about, don't take wives for yourselves, or don't take spouses for yourselves from the land of the Canaanites, etc., etc., etc. But there actually was no prohibition on marrying a Moabite woman, or if you were a woman, marrying a Moabite husband. What they do have is this verse here in Deuteronomy chapter 23. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord." So this is the... Oh, got to go back here. Ruth 1:4. So this is the prohibition that they do have. If you take a wife from the Moabites, if you take a husband from the Moabites, which you can, they're just never, ever going to be allowed into the assembly, into the Hebrew assembly. And that is the provision that they had in place. So marry them if you want, just know they're never going to really fit in. They're never going to really be one of us. They're always going to be on the outskirts, never able to join the assembly. And so we have Orpah, the first, and then the other was Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. And Ruth we'll see this eventually, but Ruth is going to end up being an exemplar. I mean, she is going to be the standard for women, right? And actually, in the Hebrew tradition, the book of Ruth comes right after Proverbs. Proverbs 31, if you know it, she comes right after Proverbs 31, where it talks about this amazing, industrious, and wonderful woman. And then you have the book of Ruth, as if they're trying to guide you into saying Ruth is the fulfillment of that. So Ruth is going to end up being a very important, prominent, and godly person, as it turns out. And then I'll fast forward a little bit. The book ends with the revelation that Ruth is going to end up giving birth, and out of her genealogy is going to come King David, right? And at the time of King David, there would have been some people that would question, like, hey, his lineage is from the Moabites. He can't lead the people of Israel. And so the book of Ruth is kind of presenting an argument like, okay, yeah, maybe Ruth was a Moabitess, but look at what kind of woman she was. I mean, she wasn't just any Moabite woman. She was Ruth. She was the embodiment of Proverbs 31. And so who cares if that's where David came from? Look at her. She's amazing. And of course, as we know, ultimately out of Ruth's line comes David, and then eventually comes the Lord Jesus himself. Need a little bit of a water break. So there's a little bit there about Orpah and Ruth. And then after 10 years, both Machlon and Chilion also died. And the woman, Naomi, was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. She's not completely alone. She has Orpah and she has Ruth, but she's lost her 2 sons. She's lost her husband. She's in a foreign land of her enemies. Her people still don't have food as far as she knows. And she is just sitting in this immense and terrible sorrow. I can't even imagine what she was thinking. Just pain and having to endure that and be strong for her sons. Be strong. Well, not her sons anymore. Sorry. Be strong for her daughters-in-law. Just a terrible, terrible fate that she had. Then, important little word there. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. At rock bottom, as the worst that she could imagine had come, she receives news, good news, finally, after all of the calamity, after the famine, the travel, the entering the land of her enemies, the death of her husband, the death of her sons, living as a widow in that time. Finally, she gets good news. The Lord has visited his people and has given them food. The word food here is the word lechem in Hebrew. It's Bethlehem, right? The house of bread. Well, now we're going back to that bread. The Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. The thing that she had left Israel because they didn't have, now they had it. So now we're going to get into the next scene, the return, because they finally have the bread. And again, if we tie this into the cycles, if we tie this into the cycles of Israel, we know that this probably means that Israel had repented after those 10 years. Israel had repented. They had acknowledged their God. They had received him as truth again, and they had turned from their wicked ways. And so he had removed his judgment from them and had given them food. Because remember, the famine was there because Israel had apostatized. So now that they've turned back to him, he can present them with food once more. And so what we're going to see is that she's going to leave and she's going to head back to Israel, and there's going to be a lot of dialogue there. But we will talk about that in the next Bible by the Bite, because I'm trying to just take it one bite at a time. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this was encouraging to you. Let me know in the comments if I should do more of these, or if this was just a one-off and I should just quit while I'm ahead and not do this anymore. But hey, thanks a bunch for tuning in. I appreciate you. Adios.